Have you ever noticed how easy it is to see what's wrong with everyone else? And you can get caught up in that complaining or that loop. And essentially, you're the one struggling from all of that. You're the one reliving it, and it's lasting for days. You know, that colleague who didn't prepare enough, or the person who keeps making the same mistake, or your partner who keeps doing the same thing over and over again, even if you've asked them not to. We get caught up in that loop of living it over and over again and struggling with it. They might be moving on with their lives and they're already in a different place. So, you know, the interesting part of this is not really the moments that we're experiencing that thing we're complaining about, but how we're showing up and how we're experiencing it. And in those moments, we actually feel pretty certain we know we're right, or we know what the problem is, or what they should do differently, or what should be different. And sometimes we are right. Sometimes the work is sloppy, or the person is repeating a behavior that's not helpful for the couple, or, you know, so this isn't really about pretending everything's okay when it's not. I'm not criticizing the critic in this episode. What I'm interested in here is what happens when we get hooked, when the situation has completed and we're still carrying on with it, and our mind keeps returning to it, and when we're spending a lot more energy on things than we really need to. Because at that point, whether we're right or wrong isn't really the issue. What's the issue is we're the one carrying it, and we're the ones struggling. And I think we could do a lot to reduce that struggle and that stress. So I'm Victoria Fontana, and this is No User Manual, a podcast for life without instructions. Thank you for joining me. Last episode, we explored the inner critic and its voice and how it shows up in our lives as, you know, you're not good enough, and why are you doing that? You shouldn't be doing that. Be careful. They might see that you don't know what you're talking about. All of those messages that the inner critic wants to send us. And today we're going to explore what happens when that critic turns outward. So we no longer call it the inner critic, we just call it the critic. And more importantly, how can we work with it, especially when it's causing us trouble, when it's making us suffer more than we need to. And those moments are really important because when we are noticing criticism, it's telling us a lot about what's important to us and what we're looking at and how, you know, we feel about something. Those are really important moments because if we know how to look at them, we can really learn a lot about ourselves. So let me give you an example. Many years ago, actually, I was on a team and we were preparing some slides for a program that we were delivering. My colleague sent out the slides and I was looking at them, and little by little, I started getting a little kind of like that inner, something about these is just not sitting right with me. And it wasn't the content. Everything was good. It had enough of what it needed, but the formatting just wasn't consistent. The design wasn't there. There was no pictures. There was no aesthetic to it. All the fonts were different in different pages. And so part of me was just not having it. And I ran it by them. I said, hey, do you mind if I fix these a little, or, work on the slides a little? And they were fine. But the problem really was, I started making adjustments and started fixing this slide and that slide, then a few more, and then adding some pictures here, finding a good design. And before I know it, it's 2 a.m. and I'm still working on slides. And everybody else is probably asleep wisely, and I'm the one making slides. And so, if you asked me in that moment what I was doing, I wouldn't have been like, oh, I'm, really caught in this mental pattern that's keeping me here making slides. I would have said, I'm helping out my team. I'm making this better. I care about how this looks for our team, and I have a strength and the aesthetic of things. And so I'm using my strength to make things better. And maybe part of that was true. And definitely I enjoy doing that. But, eventually the question of why am I still here becomes to me a little more important. For everybody else, everything was fine. And for me, I was so deeply involved in making it perfect. And that was where I was suffering and I was struggling, and I didn't even realize it. And over time, that's not a one-off behavior. That was something that would get repeated, whether it's the slides or the lesson or whatever it is, right? And so that criticism is a result of noticing something that doesn't conform to your expectation. But the clue into where it becomes something a little more on the line or spectrum of suffering is that I'm getting hooked in. Something's holding me back, right? It's the conversation or the behavior, the decision or the mistake or whatever it is. And my attention would keep returning to it. And at some point, we begin paying a price, right? And maybe we get tension or frustration, or in my case, losing sleep, or maybe we're carrying around an unnecessary burden. And it doesn't have anything to do with the event anymore. It has to do with how we're relating to whatever the scenario is and how we're showing up in that scenario. That's where curiosity can become really helpful, because instead of saying like, what's wrong with them, or what's wrong with this team, or what's wrong with me or us or whatever, my question would be, what's going on inside me? What's happening right now? And what is that reaction pointing towards? Right. And so I want to be really careful here and I'm not criticizing the criticism. Not every criticism comes from fear, or not every complaint is a defense mechanism, or, sometimes what we're noticing really is important. It's something that we care about. And that's really a cue into what we care about. Now, one of the first questions, and I want to look at this through three different lenses. And the first one is the values. What are the values that we're holding in this scenario that are being touched? In my case, with the slides, I was valuing quality or excellence and aesthetic, right, in particular. And the irritation I was noticing, or maybe just discomfort, was around those not being the way I wanted them to be. And so when I recognize that there is something actually that I'm holding as a value that's driving my behavior and my perception of this whole experience, that really changes a lot, because it gives me a lot of information. It told me a lot about what mattered to me. What matters to me is that things really look nice, and that there's a presentation and there's a polish to something, right? Now, the other people on my team were perhaps valuing something different, right? I could see my values, and then I could say, well, I wonder what they were valuing. No, obviously it wasn't the same aesthetic as I was valuing, but maybe they were valuing something different, like quality of data that was in those slides, or getting things done in a certain way, maybe more quickly or more efficiently, right? Maybe they have families and they value spending time with their family, and they're going to put in the right amount of effort to these slides, that they gauge is right according to the task, right? And so I think a lot of our conflicts become a lot more understandable, number one, when we start looking through the lens of not who's right here, or who's better, or who's, a better professional, but what matters to each person here. What are we each valuing? And then that really helps us if there was a need. In this case of the slides, it wasn't necessary, but oftentimes there's a conversation that might take place, and we can talk through values and say, oh, well, I'm valuing aesthetic. And the other person might be saying, well, I'm valuing, getting it done and spending some time with my family. And it really opens a lot of space for conversation. I also recognized in that scenario that I was overusing a value. Sometimes making things excellent is great, but if you're up till 3 a.m, that's overuse of that value, or up to 2 a.m. or whenever. Another example would be, imagining you're getting ready for an event, and you have to be formal in that event, and your partner shows up and they're not wearing something as formal as you are. They're a lot more casual, and you have a reaction, no? Like maybe it's irritation or embarrassment or judgment. And the mind gets really busy around that. And why would they wear that? Or can they not see where we're going? Or, do they even care that we look good? Whatever it is that might come in. And again, there's a value happening there, right? Maybe it's respect for the occasion, or creating a certain, a value around the impression that you're giving, because it's important because of the context, and all of that's real. But then when we ask what that partner might be valuing, maybe they're valuing their comfort or authenticity or ease or freedom. And so when we get curious again, that's when the situation actually becomes a lot more human and a lot more workable. The other issue with values is that they can easily slip into rules or shoulds, right? And this is where we can get stuck, because it's not that the value is wrong innately, but it's because the value becomes a rule that it leads to conflict or disagreement. No, so a value says, I care about professionalism, but the rule says, well, everybody needs to always be professional. Or I care about excellence, and the rule says everything needs to meet my standard, right? Or I care about consideration or being considerate, and then the rule says, no, everybody should behave the way I think they should behave. And so we can really get into some interesting arguments with reality when that happens. And reality rarely is following our rules, right? They're very personal rules, and not necessarily everybody's rules or the reality. And so that's one thing, to really explore our values. Explore, are we overusing them? What are the other person's values? And are my values becoming rules? Going a little deeper, we could see that values aren't always what's happening. A lot of times in my coaching, I see some other things go on aside from values or in addition to values. So maybe on one end, something feels threatened, right? Maybe it's our reputation or our competence, maybe our sense of belonging, a concern about how others might perceive us. And so an example would be a leader on a team who says to me in our coaching that their team is underperforming, right? And so the real concern is, hey, I've got work to do, and that work has to be turned into my higher ups. And if my team doesn't perform, I look bad, right? And so that's a fear. It's a fear of not looking well and not maybe getting a promotion or being seen as a bad leader, whatever it is. And so this fear of how we think others will perceive us is driving the criticism, really. And so it's not really about the slide deck or the formal event or the project the team member's working on. It's really a bigger thing. And we can really tune into the question of what am I protecting? When I have such high standards for myself, for example, there's some researchers, Miriam Mongrain and Donald Zuroff, and they found that people who are highly self-critical often bring that same critical style into their relationships with others. And oftentimes people who are high performers are highly critical, right? A lot of the leaders that I coach, and they're leaders and they're in those positions for a reason, because they have high expectations. But when that criticism turns towards others, it doesn't always help actually create the performance that they're seeking. And so the pattern's the same. The inner critic turns towards us, and the outer critic, is the same message, just turning towards the world around us. So the second question there is then again, what am I protecting? Am I protecting my reputation? Am I protecting a position I'm in, or whatever it is? And again, we're not criticizing ourselves for having these patterns. It's just part of being a human being. But when we can notice them, then we have a lot more flexibility. The third area I want to propose that we explore is the question of what am I avoiding? This could be really a very revealing question because we might find that there's behaviors that we're avoiding or discomfort that we're avoiding. Stephen Hayes, one of the founders of acceptance and commitment therapy, has written extensively about, our experiential avoidance. That's the idea that we kind of organize our lives around avoiding difficult internal experiences. And so those could be something like conflict or discomfort or disappointment, vulnerability. The leaders that I work with, for example, maybe they are saying they want things to turn out because they want to look good for their bosses. That other example of the fear of what am I protecting? In this case, avoiding might be on that same example could be I'm avoiding conflict. I don't want to disappoint my team members. I don't want to make them work too hard. So I take on the work myself, right? Or I correct the work myself, or they're underperforming, but I don't want them to be mad and retaliate. So I'm avoiding the discomfort of those difficult conversations. And so team members often avoid vulnerability, right? Maybe they cover up a mistake because they don't want to have the discomfort of the vulnerability. And that becomes complaints about their boss, for example, right? They're giving me too much work. They're doing, so we can really dig into all of these quite a bit and find a lot of different aspects to it. And it could be many different things. There's not one right answer. But there is the possibility that within whatever this complaint is disguising is an avoidance. And criticism can become part of that. And it's really easy because it's easier to criticize or complain about something. And that keeps me from having to have that conversation or learn that skill that I'm uncomfortable with, that I don't want to experience. And so being right or trying to frame it as I'm right and they're wrong, or that outward criticism is a lot easier sometimes than just accepting a reality that maybe I do need to learn some skills. And so again, this is all workable. And the beauty is this ability to develop self-awareness by looking at what's going on in our situations and in our criticism. So criticism towards others is a really wonderful and fruitful place to explore and learn about ourselves and create self-awareness about when we're showing up with a value, when we're showing up and trying to protect ourselves, and when we're avoiding discomfort. And that's where mindfulness can become a really great roadmap for you to develop that self-awareness. And so what we're doing in mindfulness is investigating our experience. We use different areas, and I've talked about this in past episodes. We talk about noticing what's going on in my body. When I saw those slides the way they were, there's a little kink or a little tension in the body that says, this isn't right. Noticing what's going on in my emotions, maybe a discomfort or a frustration or whatever it is that you're experiencing, and noticing thoughts that are arising. And then also noticing actions, like the action of staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning doing slides. That was a reaction. That was not a chosen response. It was me fixing things and making things feel right so that I could go to bed knowing that I had the slides the way I wanted them. In the meantime, hurting myself. We can also ask these questions and through this mindful awareness, become aware, what am I valuing? What is the other person valuing? What value is not being honored here? Or where is my value and their value kind of coming into conflict? Or maybe I have two conflicting values. The example of the leader wanting to look good for the higher ups and, wanting to get that work done the right way. So they spend all their time correcting the work that their team member does. So on one end, I'm protecting my reputation and I'm working towards excellence. And on the same end, I have another value, which is not hurting people's feelings. So I don't have those conversations with the team members. And so wanting to do one thing and do the other might not always kind of help each other, right? So we can look at what is the whole array of values that I have. If I value my time as a leader, right? And now I'm spending my time doing the work they should do, I'm not serving that value because I'm serving a different value, which is not creating conflict, for example. And then, is what I'm valuing becoming a should or a rule? And then what is it that feels threatening here? Or what am I protecting? And then what am I avoiding? And all of those questions can be seen a little more clearly when we kind of open that mindful lens, which means we look at it. Maybe we start with the body. We start with noticing just what's here, the body, the mind, the thoughts, the emotions. And then we can ask those questions with kind of an air of kindness and non-judgment so that whatever the answer is, we're not getting kind of played by our shame button or feeling embarrassed about showing up in that way, because it's just part of being human. And then finally, what we can come to in mindfulness is the clarity. This is what's happening. These are the values underneath. This is what I'm trying to protect. That's what they're trying to protect. And what is the best response here? What is a response that would really serve my values, our team's values, our family's values? What's a response that would be in service of me, in service of the other people here, or the main goal we have, whatever it is. And that clarity is what helps us see a response. So the goal isn't to just, resign to, either I'm complaining and that's how things should be, or I'm complaining and I shouldn't be complaining. It's really about understanding what that reaction and that nonconformity is trying to teach us about what we're valuing, what we're protecting ourselves from, what we might be avoiding, and what we really need in each scenario and each situation. And so those times where criticizing others can be really great pieces of information and a roadmap into understanding ourselves in a new way. Once we understand that, once we have that data, then we have a lot more space for choice than we did before. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you have any questions or things you'd like to untangle together, please let me know in the comments. And I'm Victoria Fontana. This is No User Manual, a podcast for life without instructions. Take good care.